Welcome to the channel. Today we're canning plums. Now, if you've never canned before, plums is a great way to start out. They're super easy and you're bound to get great results. Now, besides the plums, we're going to need something to rinse them in. So I've got a big colander. I've got a water bath canner. You could also use a pressure cooker if you'd like. We've got some sanitized and clean canning jars. Those are quarts, sugar, and a USDA complete guide to home canning. Now, you can purchase these books at your local extension office, or you can look up your extension office online and probably purchase it from their website. Now, the first step is to wash off this white stuff and any dust that may be on the plums. I like to use a shower because it has a movable head and a lot more water pressure than my kitchen sink. So I've got our plums rinsed off now, and there's a couple different ways you can do this. You could leave the plums whole with the pit in them, or if you have freestone plums, you can cut them in half and remove the pit. Now, if you cut them in half, you can pack more plums into a jar because the smaller pieces are easier to pack in a jar, so they leave less free space. So that's up to you. Either way it works. Now we're going to jump to our book here, and it gives us kind of a guide on how much fruit is needed per batch. So I'm using quart jars, and my canner fits 7 quarts, which matches up with the book here, and it says an average of about 14 pounds is needed for that. Now, I probably don't have 14 pounds because I've already done a couple of batches, but we're just going to finish up with what I've got. I've got plenty of jars clean. So now we're going to make the syrup. Now, it gives us the option of light, very light, or medium. Now, what I've found is if I use the lower sugar content syrups, that my kids don't like it. And if my kids don't want to eat the fruit, it doesn't do me much good. So I'm going to do the medium syrup. And it sends us to the other page, 2.5. So for the medium syrup, it's calling for a 7-quart load, is 8 1/4 cups of water and 3 3/4 cups sugar. So I'm gonna go ahead and put that together. I'm gonna put it in a big pot and start heating it to get it to boil. In the meantime, I'm gonna pack my jars. Okay, I've got my 8 1/4 cup water and my 3 3/4 cup sugar mixed together in this pot on the stove, and I'm bringing it up to a boil now. It's kind of slow to boil because it's quite a bit of water, and I don't have it turned on super high because I need time to pack the fruit into the jars. Now, while I'm doing this, I've also put water in my water bath canner, and I've got it on the stove as well, and I'm starting to heat it up. Now, the reason I do this is because it's such a large volume of water that it takes a while to come up to a boiling point. So while I'm packing the fruit into the jars and waiting for this one to boil, this is heating up. That way, by the time I'm done packing the fruit into the jars, this should be really close to ready. And then I can just put my hot jars into the hot water, and it'll only take a few minutes to bring it to a boil, as opposed to waiting a long time for the entire canner to warm up. That and the syrup I'm putting in the jars is boiling, so the jars are going to be hot. Now, if I put hot jars into cold water, it could shatter the glass, and vice versa. If the jars were cold and I put them in a boiling hot water, there's a potential that it could shatter the glass. Now, I want to avoid that. The jars are going to be hot, the water is going to be hot, so there's way less chance of glass breaking. Now, on my water bath canner, this one's kind of neat because it has the volume markings on the side. Now, I don't know exactly where the water is supposed to be for the 7-quart load, but I just have been ballparking it. I'm like 3/4 an inch below the 12-quart mark. Now, I believe that'll bring the water up to an inch above my jars once the jars are submerged. I may be wrong. We're going to find out. But that's what I do. I heat up the water bath while I'm doing the rest of the process because it's such a large volume of water. It takes a while to heat up, and I'm trying to time out everything so it works out well. Our syrup's going kind of slow. I'll just turn the burner up a little bit, and that'll should have enough time to pack the jars before this gets to a boiling point. I forgot to mention this earlier, but I also have lids and rings. And you don't have to have a canning funnel, but they're very handy, and I would definitely suggest one, as well as a ladle. Like, you could use a spoon, but the ladle, you know, will work a lot faster. Now, packing the plums into the jars is a fairly simple task. Whether you've cut them in half and de-stone them, or you're just putting them in whole, it's not too hard. The biggest issue that we run into is airspace. Like, the plums don't pack in very tightly, and so there'll be larger gaps. And a good way around that is to take the jar and kind of firmly tap it on the table. Now that's going to pack it down, and it's pretty helpful in using the most space you can. Now, if I was trying to be super efficient, I would definitely be cutting these in half and de-stoning them, but I have more lids than I have time, so it's just easier for me to do this. And we're going to fill it up until we have about a ½ inch of headspace. So this is timing out pretty well. By about the 5th jar that I packed, our syrup had started boiling, and so I pulled it off the stove and brought it over to where I've got the jars at. So I only had to pack 2 more jars, and then the water bath canner's close to a boil, so I turned it down to like medium high. I probably could have left it where I was at, but making a video, so wanted to buy a little bit of time, and this will give me time to put some syrup in the jars. Now, if you notice, some of these plums are not at a ½ inch of headspace. A ½ inch of headspace would be like here, but I've got these plums above it. Now, the reason is that when the plums are being canned, they'll cook and they'll become more pliable. And so these plums will actually go down lower, and because they're soft to the touch. Like, if I press down on that plum, it goes below the surface rim of the jar. So it's not going to interfere with my lid. It's not pushing up on it. And as it gets cooked, it's going to go down in anyway. And that allows me to get one more plum into the jar. Probably not the most advisable thing to do, but it works pretty good. Another thing about plums is you see how they've got the whitish haze around them, right? That these Italian plums naturally have. If you don't rinse them off well enough, after you've canned them, white stuff can float up to the top of the jar. So if you see that, that's a good indication that maybe you didn't rinse them off well enough before you canned them. I rinsed these pretty good. I didn't scrub them, but it should work all right, and I shouldn't have any of that white stuff. Now, another thing with mason jars when you're canning is you want to check the rim of each one for chips and to make sure that there's no gunk or like old sealant left over from the lids that were on there previously. I've checked all these. It's a good thing to do every time you can, because it's really sad you put in the work and then the jar doesn't seal. So make sure to do that. And so we've got our syrup and our canning funnel. And I mentioned ½ inch of headspace, and so that's what we're shooting for. Now, what I like to do is I like to put it really close to the syrup kettle so that there's less chance of spillage. And then I like to put the jars all in a line because there's less chance of spilling if I've got it all in order and everything's close to each other. So you don't have to do that, but hopefully it helps you out a little bit, because you can just move the jar over a little bit and you're good to go. So we're gonna go ahead, ladle some in, and when I reach the ½ inch mark, I'll just grab the next jar and keep going. If you guys can see that very well, but it's easy enough to gauge. You just want a ½ inch below the rim of the jar. If you go over, it's okay. You can always just spoon it out. Ooh, that's probably good. And so I'm just gonna go to the next jar and keep going until I'm all done. I've got all the plums packed in the jars with the syrup on them, and they're all about a ½ inch of headspace. Now the next step is to rinse the lids off, which I've done. I've got them in a bowl right here. You want to do that in case there's any like cardboard particles from the box that they were in or anything like that. I like to inspect the seals as well just to make sure they are good. And then you get a damp paper towel, a clean one of course, and you wipe the rims of the jars because you want that nice clean sealing surface for the lids to attach to. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And if you notice, of a special guest. These are all narrow mouth jars. This is a wide mouth jar. The reason I've got that is because the procedure for putting the lids on is just a little bit different. So I want to go ahead and show you that. But I'm going to wipe these rims off real quick. Okay, I've got all the rims wiped off. And now I want to show you the difference in how you handle these two. Now the wide mouth jar, it's really important to put the lid on there and make sure it's centered first. And this is going to be really hard to do with one hand, but generally what I do is I put the lid on, I center it. I normally don't have fruit pushing the lid up, but this is plum, so I do it a little different. This might not be the best example to follow with the plum pushing the lid up. However, I can push it down, and since I stuck my fingers through the ring first, I've got the ring there ready to screw on. And I look at the sides and I make sure it's centered. The reason I do that is because apparently on the wide mouth lids, there's a little bit of extra wiggle room there. And so you can get the lid off to the side a bit and it won't seal. And that could definitely be a problem when your whole task is to seal and cook these to preserve them. So that's how we do the wide mouth. Now, the narrow mouth jars are a lot easier. I don't know if I've ever had an issue with them sealing before. And it's kind of the same deal. But we don't have to be as careful. I don't know if I've ever had one that didn't seal. So again, I set the lid on there, I center it. Normally it sits flush on the top, but I'm doing plums, so I try to shove in too many probably. Just know that I get away with it, and it may not be recommended. I'm sure the canning book says probably not to do that. They say to leave ½ inch of head space, and that's what you should follow. So just because I'm doing it doesn't mean you should do it. Because the book says to do something else. So I would highly suggest following what the book says. Now, when you tighten these lids, the rings, when we first started, my wife and I, we didn't know how tight to make these, and we tried to, lock them on there real tight. Now, the issue with that is when you put this in the canner, the fluid and the air in there expands. Now, if you can't bleed that air out under pressure, the jar can pop. And what we were finding was the bottoms would pop out of some of our jars, and we didn't know why. And then I figured it out. It's because we're putting the rings on too tight. And so you want tight, but not too tight. And the way the ring is formed, it kind of puts spring pressure down on there. So you don't have to really reef it on there. I'm doing this one-handed, and I'm totally comfortable, even though I'm doing it one-handed, that is tight enough to seal when I can it. And you can see when you put them in the canner that the air will come out of those. And that's a good thing. You want that extra air out of there because when you're done, you want it to be a vacuum. You want the vacuum to suck that lid down and the sealant is melted and it locks on there. So it's a vacuum and it's totally sanitary when it's been canned. So I'm gonna finish these off and we'll put them in the canner. All right, so I've got all the lids and rings on and I set them in the canner. The jars are hot. The canner's hot as you can see it, and so I don't have to worry about the glass shattering. Now we're gonna go ahead and lower these in. And I can do it one side at a time with this without an issue. Now if it was shorter jars like jam jars, the jars might fall over, but I've done it with quartz quite a bit, so it's all right. And if it's hard to tell in the video, but there's more than an inch of water covering the lids. There's probably like an inch and a half here, but I'm not boiling over yet. I mean, there's still time. It might boil over, but that's no big deal because it's just water. And if it's too bad, I'll take a ladle and I'll just ladle out some of the extra water so it doesn't boil over anymore. And I'm gonna go ahead and put the lid on, and we're gonna turn on the vent fans so I don't steam out my house. And then we're gonna wait. We're gonna wait until this comes to a rolling boil. Now, rolling boil is where there's not just bubbles coming up, but it's churning the top of the water. That's a rolling boil. So I'm gonna turn the fan on and wait for that. And while we wait for that, I wanna go over a couple of things that I didn't mention earlier. What I wanted to mention was in the book, under the plum section here, is there's two different ways to do plums. There's hot pack and there's raw pack. Now we specifically did raw pack for a reason. And that's because what we found is the more the plums are cooked, the more likely they are to fall apart. So in the jar, they look better if they've been raw pack because the plums stay in one piece more often than not. And also when you're taking them out of the jar, dishing them into a bowl or whatever to serve them, if they've been done hot pack or if they've got cooked too long, they're more likely to fall apart. And so it's a little messier of an ordeal, and there's no real difference on the quality of the fruit in the jar in raw pack versus hot pack. You don't get a better result if you do hot pack, at least in my opinion, or that I've seen. So we do the raw pack for a reason. That's what I did. We're gonna go ahead and flip to the next page because that's where our time's at. And you have to remember to check for the altitude. Now here I'm probably about 100 feet of altitude and I'm doing quarts. So that's right there. So quarts at my altitude is 25 minutes in this hot water canner. Now if you're doing a pressure cooker, it gives you the pages to check the pressure cooker time on. But the book that came with your pressure cooker should have that as well. So you should be all right, I would imagine. So we're gonna go ahead and let our canner come to a boil and we'll set the timer. My timer just went off. I wanna show you something really quick. It was on the high when we first started, but as it started to boil more and more, I turned it down to the 7 so it wouldn't get too crazy. You can see we're getting a little kicking out right now, but that kept it at a steady boil, at least on my stove. Now, I turned off the heat because the time is over. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna slide it off of the heat. Now you don't have to do that, but it's just what I do. So it's off that burner. And I'm gonna take the lid off. Well, maybe after it stops boiling. But I'm doing that so that the water cools down. What I'm not gonna do is I'm not gonna raise the jars up and I'm not gonna take them out. The reason why is if you do that, the water in the jars will still boil. So you pull that jar out and the water in the jar will boil and then it'll boil out of the jar. And that's not a good thing. So what I like to do is remove it from heat and let the kettle cool down. And then once the kettle's cooled down, about 15 minutes, then because my rack can pull the jars about halfway up and the rack locks on the side of the kettle, that's what I'll do. So I'll let it sit like this off the heat for 15 minutes. Then I'll raise that rack up. You know, I'll take like this big fork here. I'll just grab the handles and I'll raise one side up at a time. Or if these were smaller jars, I'd, you know, come in from each side and do them both at the same time. And I'll raise it rack up and that'll bring the jars about halfway out of the water. And then I let them sit like that for about another 15 minutes. And that's so that they can cool down gradually so that they don't boil over. So right now, off the heat, 15 minutes, maybe 20. Then I'll raise the rack so the jars are halfway out of the water in another about 15-20 minutes. And then I take the jars all the way out and I'll set them on a towel on the counter, and they'll sit there overnight. And that's so that the seal can set, and once they're cool enough to touch, then I'll check the lids to make sure they're all sealed. I'm sure they will be, but if they don't, I'll take the unsealed jar and I'll put it in the fridge, or we'll eat it fresh. And we've had to do that with wide mouths before because we didn't get the lid totally centered. I'm sure these will probably totally all be fine. Another thing I want to mention is, if you can tell, the water's discolored. Now that happens from time to time. It doesn't happen all the time. We've never had it cause an issue except for sticky jars. So once the jars have sat overnight, the seal is set, then I'll rinse the jars off. But nothing to worry about, at least in my experience. You can check with others. You can see I've got them up in the half rack position now. Some time has definitely gone by. It's been a little over 20 minutes. I had other stuff I had going on. I just heard one jar seal, and if you look at the syrup in there, there's not a bunch of bubbles rising up, so I'm not worried about them boiling over. So I'm going to go ahead and pull them out and put them on a towel on the counter, and I'll wait for all of them to seal. This is the one that sealed, I think. There we go. There's the sound of victory. I'm still waiting on a few of these jars to seal up. It might be hard to tell in the video, but this jar, the bubble in the middle is still up, and whereas if it was sealed, it'd be down. That's one way to tell if they're sealed. You can see like this one, probably hard in the video, but this one's down and this one's up. So that's one way to tell if they're sealed. I brought out a a jar of cherries to show you another way to check. And we just like to double check because we like to be cautious. And what I'll do is I'll flick it, and it'll make a higher pitched noise if it's under vacuum and it's sealed, as opposed to if it's not sealed, it'll make a dull thud. And you can see that on the cherries, the ring's been removed. The reason for that is rings can mask a seal problem. Say if the lid loses seal with a ring on, you might not notice because of course it's got the ring on and the ring is holding it down. So it's easier to tell if there's a problem if the ring is off. So I take them off, and I'm going to let these sit overnight to cool down and for that seal to harden. Then I'll take the rings off, date them, and put them in the cupboard. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it's helpful. And if you like it, follow me for more videos and hit like and subscribe. Thank you.